Hey guys, so I've kind of had this thing going on recently where everyone will be talking about the next big thing game that just came out, and when people ask me if I'm playing it, I'm all like, yeah, I want to play it eventually, but I'm actually working on beating the first game in the series that came out like 10 years ago. When Elden Ring came out, that was me still working my way through the rest of FromSoft's games. On Sekiro right now, by the way, just beat Genichiro. Amazing boss, holy shit. And this year, when all my friends were talking about Baldur's Gate 3, I was saying, well, I'm actually playing Divinity Original Sin 1 from Larian Studios. Yeah, the same guys who made Baldur's Gate 3. And yeah, I'll get to Baldur's Gate 3 eventually, guys. I know it's really good. I just think going through the older games in a series and getting to see how the developer's game design changes over time is really neat, okay? And seeing if the games that kickstarted now massive franchises still hold up is really fun. Speaking of which, I recently finally completed Divinity Original Sin, and I think it's still worth playing for its combat and exploration, despite being weaker in the story department. Original Sin 1 is set in the world of Rivellon, a setting created in-house by Larian, similar in some ways to Dungeons & Dragons Faerun. It's a pretty generic fantasy setting, with one of the main distinguishing factors being that this world has different types of magic. There's normal magic like you'd encounter in every fantasy setting elsewhere, which is okay and normal, and then there's source magic, or sorcery. Get it, guys? It sounds like sorcery, but it's spelled different. Which is honestly not displayed or explained much in this game, besides it being essentially a more powerful type of magic that tends to corrupt its users. From what I hear, it plays a much larger role in Divinity Original Sin 2. But in this game, you take the lead of two protagonists, so you get to customize them both, who are part of the Source Hunter Order, an Inquisition-type faction who hunt down and eliminate users of source magic. By the way, when I talk about the story in this video, all the specifics I'm going into are stuff that you discover in the first 1 to 3 hours of the game, and it took me about 90 hours to beat it, so I'm not spoiling anything major. Making your characters in the character creator is pretty simple, as you can only really customize your character's sex, hair and skin color, and face and hair type, as well as their voice. Yeah, so strangely enough, the other way that Original Sin setting differs from D&D and most fantasy settings is that the world is devoid of other more interesting races like dwarves and elves. I mean, they are there in the lore based on books you can find and item descriptions, but actually in the game, you run into maybe 1 or 2 of them. Now, in terms of choosing how you want to build your characters, there are 12 preset classes for you to go with, but you can also manually reassign everything to create your own build. Honestly though, I would just pick one of the preset classes to work off of as a base, as it only determines a few of your starting stats and skills. The only thing I really think you should add to one of your characters is the Pet Pal talent, which will allow you to talk to random animals in the environment. Not only does this open up more dialogue options, but it can also be pretty helpful later in the game because random animals walking around, say for example a dungeon, will usually give you some clues or info that can be really helpful for figuring out puzzles or getting a better picture of what's going on. Anyway, now that you're done creating your character, you're finally ready to start your adventure. By the way, I played the game on classic difficulty, which based on the description seemed to be the intended experience. The intro of the game sees your characters make their way to the town of Sicile, where you've been tasked to investigate the recent murder of the town's mayor, with the Source Hunter Order suspecting that a sorcerer was involved in it. These first quests around Sicile have a really good mix of investigation, puzzle solving, combat, and exploration, with many of them being pretty lighthearted and a way to introduce you to some of the mechanics, like using a water spell to put out a burning boat. This is also where you choose your companions. I recruited Medora, a knight, and Biodoter, a ranger. There's also an elemental wizard and a rogue, but at the time I didn't try to recruit them because I didn't know that you could recruit more than 2 characters. One thing I started to appreciate at this point after exploring the map around Sicile is that Original Sin does exploration really well. You never have to go far before finding something interesting, whether it's a side quest or a fun combat encounter or just some extra items. The game always rewards you for going off the beaten path. I never felt like I had to uncover the rest of the map, I just ended up doing it naturally. I've also got to say that generally the puzzles in the world were pretty fun and do a good job of taking advantage of the player's ability to move items and characters around, with there often being multiple ways to solve a problem. Like if an oil slick fire is covering a floor, you can use a character with enough strength or telekinesis to move a barrel to block the oil vent and turn it off, or you could cast fire immunity on someone so they can just walk over and disarm it. Or a character with scoundrel abilities can use winged feet to hoverwalk over it, or you could just cast a teleportation spell on somebody and teleport them across. Early in the game, you even get a set of teleporter pyramids which kind of function like the portal gun. If you place one down in the world, you can use the other pyramid to teleport your characters to it. And since you can throw the pyramids like any other object, this can be handy for crossing gaps or getting through a tight area. And while for sure, like with most games involving puzzles, there were some where it seems like the puzzle designer's mind was just on the moon while they were designing it, I found most were pretty intuitive, and that the freedom I had to approach obstacles in different ways helped give me a real sense of satisfaction when I figured them out. I will say though that the game's side content is kind of front-loaded to this first act, and this can make it drag a little bit. You can easily spend your first 15 to 20 hours in and around Sicil before progressing the main story to the point where you get to other areas, but then the later towns and areas of the game have much fewer side quests, with those that are there mainly being combat oriented. I definitely understand why most RPGs don't immediately plop you down in the biggest town in the game like they've done here, because it kind of feels like they blew their load too early, and it made the pacing for the first act of this game feel kind of slow. Now, as you continue to explore Sicil and investigate the murder, you'll discover a starstone, which teleports you to the end of time. This becomes kind of like your main base, where you can send companions you don't want to travel with, buy unique upgrades, and progress a bunch of story shit. It's kind of like Firelink Shrine or Majula from the Souls games. But initially, when you're teleported here, you get a giant lore dump that lets you know that an extra-dimensional dragon exists and wants to destroy the universe, and that there's a cult trying to open a rift to help it do that. As it turns out, the murder of Sicil's mayor is just a small part of this cult's plans. The characters you meet here will also reveal that time itself has been damaged, and that the Source Hunter's souls have a deeper connection both to the origins of Source and how the Void Dragon was originally kept at bay. This is the foundation for the rest of the story. Investigate the cult, find starstones to reveal your past, and stop the Void Dragon from destroying the world. It's a pretty standard plot, but not terrible, and the voice acting really helps elevate the dialogue.
Do you remember when you first arrived on this plane? When the dormant portal that led us to this hall sprang to life?
The ethereal threads of eternity. Do I record the deeds of gods and men, of beasts and spectral apparitions?
Well, except with Medora. That southern accent is just...
Careful, comrade. I think I sense a sorcerer in yonder shadows.
Just stop. Just no. Now, the problem I had is that I found it hard to actually get immersed in the story. I only recall a few instances in the entire game where choosing a dialogue option will lock you out of other dialogue options, like, for example, choosing a rude response that makes an NPC less willing to give you information. Additionally, the dialogue options are written in a quite neutral way, so it's hard to roleplay as a character that has a certain personality or view on the main quest. Combining this with the lackluster character creation, and I really didn't feel like either of my characters were actually, well, characters. And I think this kind of cheapens the dialogue because it makes getting information from an NPC kind of into a rote task where you just click every option in turn and try to remember the important information. You don't have to process the information like you're actually having a conversation. There's no nuance, it's just hit button, get info. Now the game does have what it calls a trait system, which is a way it sort of represents different aspects of your character's personality. In the traits menu here, you'll see that my character has a bunch of traits that are arranged in these binary spectrums, for example, compassionate to heartless. And how this works is that throughout the game, there will be moments where each of your main characters will speak to each other to share opinions on whatever just happened or to make a choice. And with these reactions or choices, you'll only ever be given two that represent either side of one of these spectrums. So if it's using that compassionate to heartless spectrum we saw earlier, one response will be like, yeah, it's really sad that guy died, that was unfair. And the other one will be like, weak idiots get what's coming to them. Obviously paraphrasing a little bit, but you know, it's kind of that kind of dichotomy. Now the obvious problem with these either or options is that they don't really allow you to get that much depth with your characters because there's literally no middle ground. And you know, it's kind of boring as a player because it's not like, oh, sometimes there's 4 options to choose from or 3, you know, just varying up the amount of choice you have. But no, it's just, okay, pick 1 or pick 2, that's it. But what's less apparent is that if you lean into one trait enough, it will actually give you stat bonuses, which I don't like because it might incentivize players to choose dialogue options based on stats rather than role-playing or how they want the story to go. These choices also have very little impact on the main story, as most of the time, your characters are just talking to themselves and it seems like nobody really overhears or remembers what they say, which also kind of feels weird. But sometimes this system is used to make choices about what to do in certain side quests, usually relatively minor stuff that doesn't affect the overall plot. But what's cool is that if you make your two main characters disagree in their choice, you can actually trigger a persuasion check to see which character's choice will win out. And that kind of is good for role-playing if you have an idea of this character's gonna have one personality and this character's gonna have another. The problem is that since neither of my characters really had a defined personality or motivation, most of the time I just made them agree so that I could get the choice that I wanted originally. You can also persuade NPCs, but again, this by and large isn't used to allow the players to make any impact on the way that the main story goes. It's usually just used to unlock a new way to solve a small problem within a quest, like convincing someone to tell you where a side path is. Also, I gotta say, this persuasion minigame sucks. The way it works is that you play rock, paper, scissors with your persuasion target, and whoever wins a round gets a certain number of points based on their stats, typically using charisma. Those points fill up this bar, and if you do it before your target does, you succeed in persuading them. I get that they were trying to do something different than D&D's dice rolling here, but I think this is worse. As far as I can tell, having higher stats doesn't make you more likely to win an individual rock, paper, scissors round, and NPCs don't seem to use any strategy, so winning rounds is completely RNG based. So while having higher stats means you'll fill up your bar faster, it's still dependent on actually winning RNG rolls. I just ended up auto-resolving it most of the time because this little game wasn't fun. Much preferred just having a straight percentage chance. I was also surprised that the companions also have very little involvement in the main story. At most, they might offer their thoughts on something after the source hunters are done talking. They're treated like passive observers to the plot when they're just as involved in fighting the big bads as your main two characters. Hell, they're treated worse than passive observers. If you try speaking to NPCs as one of your companions, they will be incredibly rude to them, which just makes no sense in the game world. It's not like they're canonically my servants or something, and that this type of treatment is established lore that's shown in other ways in the world. It doesn't make much sense. Each companion has their own side quest as well, but surprisingly, these are simpler than most of the normal side quests. I'd pretty much forgotten about Biododer's backstory and motivations until I randomly ran into the single NPC related to her quest while exploring later in the game. Medora's backstory was a bit better. She used to be a source hunter in a village called Hunter's Edge, but when orcs attacked, she wasn't able to save anyone and barely escaped the town with her life, vowing to settle the score with the orcs. Several times throughout the main quest, my party ran into people that were from Hunter's Edge and knew Medora, which resulted in some brief dialogue relating to that. And later in the game, you can travel to Hunter's Edge as part of the main quest line, where you can help her get revenge. But despite being better than Biododer's questline, as I mentioned before, this wasn't really a standout quest compared to any of the other side quests, and the companion quest really should be. These are the characters that are standing shoulder to shoulder with you the whole game. We should have plenty of non-gameplay reasons to care about them. Now, despite me complaining about the main story for like 3 minutes now, what really kept me excited about this game was, on top of the exploring the world, the combat system and progressing my characters. Now, when talking about Divinity Original Sin's combat system, I'm going to compare it a little bit to D&D and Baldur's Gate 3 because those are the ones that I'm more familiar with, and I imagine with D&D surging in popularity recently and Baldur's Gate 3 coming out, a lot of you guys are probably more familiar with them as well. So the two biggest differences in the combat that I noticed from D&D is that there isn't a separation between the resource that you use for attacks, spells, and movement, and that elemental interactions have a larger role to play. So in D&D, you have a certain amount of movement per turn based on your character's stats, and then one action which you can use for attacking or using items, etc. And then some abilities can also be used with a bonus action, which you have one of them per turn as well. Now in Divinity, everything in combat costs AP, or action points. Whether that's attacking, moving, drinking a potion, equipping an item, doesn't matter. I found that this results in a lot less movement in combat compared to D&D, because unlike in D&D where you can move your max distance and then attack, in Divinity the farther you move, the more AP it costs, so even moving half your max movement range might prevent you from using a combat ability that turn. But another factor to consider is that AP you don't use will carry over to the next turn, which means you can strategically do less on one turn to do more or bigger actions on your next turn. This also means that if you don't spend AP moving around, you can often attack multiple times per turn. And since opportunity attacks exist just like in D&D, this kind of rewards you for getting close to your enemy and sticking there. But of course this also applies to enemies, which can be very painful in the case of those that have large AP pools. Because of this, using elemental spells, grenades, and arrows to take advantage of Divinity's elemental interaction system is essential for combat. This goes from pretty straightforward things like shooting an enemy with a fire or poison arrow to apply a damage over time status effect, to creating combos with multiple elements to apply super useful debuffs. For example, electrifying a water surface, which could come from a water barrel in the environment, a water grenade or arrow, or a water spell, can stun enemies standing in it, skipping their turn completely. Or you could cast an oil slick spell, which will slow down any enemies caught in it, and then light said oil slick on fire. You could combine water and fire to create a steam cloud that blocks line of sight. You could freeze water or blood puddles to create a frozen surface which will trip up enemies if they try to move on it. There's a lot of possibilities and it's really fun to play around with. So because of the lack of movement and focus on applying effects to enemies, I tended to focus on movement and positioning in the beginning of fights, making sure my ranged characters were in the backline while my tankier melee characters dashed in to deal damage and take most of the aggro. After that, movement-wise, fights tended to stay fairly static as my melee characters used two-handed weapons and man-at-arms abilities to do heavy damage, cripple, and stun them from close range, while my ranged characters tried to apply area of effect damage and debuffs using elemental arrows, spells, and grenades. It does take a little while to get used to, but this combat system, as I've said before, is one of Divinity's strong suits, with there being so many ways that a fight can go based on what elements are available in the environment and how you've built your team, and how you use the other items that you find in the world like grenades and spells. And it's really satisfying to see your characters go from kind of weak at the start of the game to pretty busted by the end of it. Like, Biodota was probably one of my weaker characters, but by the end of the game, I taught her a skill which let her rain down arrows over a large area, doing massive damage that was able to completely one-shot weaker enemies. At the end of the game, I was excited to fight the big bad, not because of the story really, but to fittingly conclude this long-ass journey that I had gone on with these characters which I had built up from zeros to one-shot killing heroes. Oh, and speaking of the final boss, I'm just gonna sneak in some comments about the music here. So, the music in Original Sin is great. Pretty much every song in here is a banger. Some tracks, like the main menu theme and the music that plays in the End of Time, give me such a comfy feeling. It's like listening to the Majula OST from Dark Souls 2. They've already been added to the songs that I randomly get cravings to listen to at 3 AM. That being said, there was not enough variety in combat music. It wasn't super annoying, but it did get noticeable during a 90-hour playthrough. What took me out of it the most was that the final boss didn't even have unique music. After realizing that, I just turned off the music and played some Two Steps from Hell to make the fight feel suitably world-ending. Overall though, when I've talked about this game with my friends, the TLDR I've given them is that the combat and exploration is fun, so if you're more of a gameplay focused person, you should consider playing it in current year. But if you go into CRPGs for the story and role-playing aspects, I'd probably start with Divinity Original Sin 2 because I've heard the story is much better. That being said, if you're watching this video as it goes live, I'm playing Divinity Original Sin 2 on my stream right now, so come join me at twitch.tv/Timtra if you want to watch me struggle through that. And if you're watching this later, consider going over there and following my channel so you can be notified when I go live. Alright, thanks for watching. Bye.